Before television, there was radio. Radio repair shops lined every main street in America, paving the way for electronic repair culture. Radio technicians were trained, supply chains built, setting the stage for future electronic repair booms. However, the era of dedicated radio repair shops eventually faded away. They disappeared even before television repair shops, for reasons beyond just economics. Radios didn't just become too cheap to fix, they lost their central place in the home. During the 1930s and 40s, the radio was not a small device on a shelf. It was a substantial piece of furniture, often 3 to 4 feet tall, weighing as much as a person. These console radios were crafted from fine wood like walnut or mahogany, with a polished finish. It was a prized possession, cared for like any other fine furniture in the living room.
Positioned against the main wall, the radio was the heart of the home, a shared experience.
Its significance is hard to fully grasp without having lived through that era.
In 1930, a console radio from Sears cost between $21 and $147, a substantial investment. The highest price, $147, is equivalent to nearly $2,800 in today's currency. High-end brands like Zenith, considered a rich man's radio, commanded even higher prices. The 1936 Spartan Nocturne, a luxury model, retailed for $350.
This was nearly the price of a brand new Ford, highlighting its value as a household asset.
Such an expensive item wasn't disposable, it was repaired when a tube burned out.
Turning it on involved a brief silence as the internal tubes warmed up, a familiar part of the experience. A faint hum would slowly rise, leading to the signal, often accompanied by a glowing amber or green dial.
Voices, music, or static would sharpen into clarity as you turned the tuning knob.
The backlit dial was often the sole source of light in the room at night, adding to the listening experience. This warm glow became an integral part of the radio listening experience, often the last light before sleep.
Many fell asleep to its comforting presence, making it the last visual before drifting off.
Vacuum tubes, the heart of the radio, would eventually burn out, a common occurrence with the technology.
Each radio contained fragile glass vacuum tubes, and a single failure would halt the broadcast.
These glass components, varying in size, each performed a specific function, like amplification or detection.
Each tube was responsible for a specific function, from amplification to rectification.
When the set was on, the tubes glowed faintly orange through the ventilation slots in the back panel. You could feel the heat radiating from them, a tangible sign of the technology at work. They had a limited lifespan. Some lasted a few years, some failed in months. Their lifespan varied, with some lasting years and others failing within months. When a tube failed, the radio might go silent or emit static, signaling the need for repair. This led to the development of a strong community repair ecosystem. In early days, people often became their own repairmen for simple issues, or called one. Radios came with diagrams on the back or inside, showing where each tube was located.
These detailed diagrams allowed owners to identify and replace faulty tubes themselves.
You could pull out the tubes, put them in a bag, and take them to a local store for testing.
From the late 1920s to the early 1970s, many stores offered self-service tube testing.
Drugstores, hardware stores, grocery stores, and gas stations provided these services.
They featured self-service tube testing stations, making repairs accessible to everyone.
These metal cabinets had a tester, instructions, and a compartment with replacement tubes. They were stocked with new tubes, ready for immediate purchase if yours tested bad.
You'd find your tube on the chart, set switches, plug it in, and watch the needle swing from red to green. If the tube tested bad, you bought a new one from the cabinet for $1 or $2. Then, you'd take it home and install it yourself, often with family watching.
Salesmen regularly restocked the supply, ensuring tubes were always available for customers. For many Americans, that was the first experience of diagnosing and fixing their own electronics.
Fathers sent their kids to the drugstore on bicycles with a bag of tubes and a few dollars for replacements. It was a common household errand, much like picking up milk or other groceries.
However, not every problem was simply a bad tube needing replacement. Deeper issues, like a failed capacitor or shorted transformer, required professional expertise. These complex problems in the wiring or components needed someone with a deeper understanding of circuitry.
And in every community, there was someone who did.
The radio repairman was a fixture of American towns from the 1930s through the 1960s. Some operated out of small storefronts with a counter up front and a workbench in the back. Surrounded by gutted chassis, coils of wire, and the smell of solder and heated Bakelite.
One man on Diversey Avenue in Chicago ran a radio repair shop through the 1940s and the early 1950s, while his wife ran a small candy store in the connected space next door.
Their combined enterprise barely paid the bills, but it served the neighborhood.
That was the scale of most of these operations.
They were not businesses that made anyone rich. They were neighborhood services.
Run by people who understood how things worked. Others outfitted a truck or van with a mobile workbench and made house calls.
Carrying test equipment and a stock of common parts.
Most could fix your set right there in your living room.
Only the most difficult problems required taking the radio back to the shop.
The trade did not require a college degree, but it was not something you picked up in an afternoon either.
In the early days, anyone with enough tinkering ability could hang out a shingle.
But as radios became more complex and states began requiring licenses, formal training became necessary. The National Radio Institute, a correspondence school based in Washington, offered courses that combined study materials with hands-on projects,
including building a radio from a kit.
After World War II, enrollment surged.
Thousands of veterans who had learned electronics in the military came home looking for a trade.
repairing field radios and communications equipment under combat conditions, came home looking for a trade. They used their GI Bill benefits to pay for the training, and by the mid-1950s, the NRI was enrolling 40,000 students a year. Some of them set up shop in spare rooms, enclosed porches, and garages.
Some of them set up shop in spare rooms, enclosed porches, and garages.
One veteran in Lancaster, Ohio, ran a radio repair business from his front porch to earn extra money.
While working his regular job as a draftsman, his children were scolded for playing with the fragile tubes that lined his workspace. The school operated until 2002.
There were other schools too, but the NRI was the largest. And for decades, it was the path most radio repairmen followed into the trade. What made the economics work was the same thing that made television repair work a decade later.
The radios were expensive, and the parts inside them were modular and replaceable.
The radios were expensive, and the parts inside them were modular and replaceable.
A typical radio shop stocked around 200 types of vacuum tubes, each with a known price.
A standard FM detector tube costs 75 cents. A rectifier might be $1.50. The repair itself, labor included, might run you $5 or $10.
When the radio in your living room represented a significant household investment, that math made perfect sense.
And it supported an entire supply chain. Tube manufacturers, parts wholesalers, trade schools, publishers of service manuals with full schematics.
It was a real industry, built on the assumption that things were worth fixing. But the radio was not just an appliance. And this is where its story diverges from the television story.
Before television existed, the radio was the only source of broadcast entertainment in the home.
In the 1930s, the average American household spent more than 4 hours a day listening.
Not casually, not in the background. You sat down for it. After dinner, the dishes were cleared. Your father settled into his chair, your mother took the end of the couch, and the children sat on the floor or pulled up close. Someone turned the dial to the right station, and the room went quiet. When the show started, nobody talked. Nobody got up. For that half hour, the family was together in a way that had no equivalent before, and has not really had one since.
The kids rushed home from school to catch the afternoon serials.
Theaters in some cities refused to open until the most popular evening programs had ended. Because they knew no one would come.
You did not just listen to the radio. You organized your day around it.
And what made it different from television, which came later and took over, was that radio gave you nothing to look at.
There was no picture.
You built the picture yourself from voices and sound effects, and whatever your mind could supply.
You built the picture yourself from voices and sound effects, and whatever your mind could supply.
You saw it all, and no two people in the room saw it the same way.
A creaking door was a haunted house. Footsteps on gravel were a man walking toward danger. You saw it all, and no two people in the room saw it the same way. That was the intimacy of it. The radio was also how the country learned its news.
Roosevelt's fireside chats reached directly into living rooms.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was announced live. Election results, boxing matches, war reports from Europe.
They all came through that cabinet in the living room, through those glowing tubes, and through a single speaker cloth that the whole family leaned toward.
So when the radio broke down, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disconnection.
You lost your entertainment, your news, your connection to the rest of the country. If this brought back a memory, or if your experience was different, I would like to hear about it in the comments. And if you would like to see more stories like this, subscribing lets me know there is interest. The radio repair shop is gone, but the sound it made when those tubes warmed up, that low hum before the signal locked in, that is something you do not forget.